Welcome to New Rechts, or for our English speakers, New Right. My name is Daniël de Liever, and today I have Alvino-Mario Fantini. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Thank you for being here. For those that don't know you, Mr. Fantini is like the editor-in-chief of the European Conservative, and his work has been published in many journals, and he has served on the board of the Center of European Renewal and has done research at several institutions, such as the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Thank you for being here. It's nice to talk to you in this important times about the media and what we can do together. But before we get started, about the media itself, I'm curious, how did you get into this field of media and academics? What was the point where you went into this?
I would say it began when I was probably in high school, elementary school, about age of 16, believe it or not. I was not politicized by then. I was not interested in politics, but certain things happened in my school with some left-wing students. This is, early 80s, mid 80s, that provoked me, forced me to react, and suddenly I discovered that I was engaging in politics. So that it starts then. But then this interest in politics, in political philosophy, political theory, in cultural battles, just begins to grow and grow, carries me through university and afterwards. However, in terms of career choices, I never chose to be in the media. I always thought I would work in some aspect of business, and specifically in the financial world. That's where I was headed. But a series of other subsequent events then distracted me and took me away, thankfully, I think. I fell into journalism, I think is the expression we use. I was living in South America, and someone offered me the position as chief correspondent for an emerging wire service covering both political and economic news. And so I took it. I learned the hard way how to write a news story. It was all new to me. I'd never done it before, and I loved it. I discovered I love writing. I discovered, even more surprisingly, that I love to edit other people's writings, make them flow a little bit better. And then I started dabbling in either editorial work or ghostwriting or speechwriting for a variety of different organizations. So that in a very summary fashion is how I got to where I am today, working and publishing and editing a conservative journal and website.
Vergeet de NOS en de NPO. Het is tijd voor Nieuw Rechts, de nieuwswebsite voor rechtsdenkend Nederland.
It's great how that happens sometimes. I guess many journalists that I talk to that are in this field did not get into it by purpose. It's almost like a calling in a sense.
Absolutely.
And I think the European Conservative is one of the more famous, let's say, right-wing / conservative news outlets. But for those who maybe don't know the European Conservative, what's the goal and what's the purpose of the European Conservative?
Sure. I tend to summarize its overall mission by breaking it down into 3, 4, sometimes 5 key objectives. So first, it stems from my own natural intellectual interests, my thwarted academic interests. By that I mean, at some point I wish I had gone on to a PhD in conservative political theory, and I never did. So one of the primary objectives of the European Conservative has always been to consider different types of conservatism around the world, particularly Europe, to explore them, to compare and contrast them, see where they diverge or where they converge, and generally make the different types of rights out there in the world understandable, both to detractors of conservatism as well as to its supporters. Secondly, when we started the European Conservative many years ago, one of the things I wanted to do was to find and cultivate and promote and give a platform to young, emerging conservative voices, intellectuals, writers, philosophers, and thinkers. In other words, I like to say I wanted to find the next Roger Scruton who might be lurking in Serbia or Estonia, or find the next Remy Bragg in Spain, or Greece. So that's the second key objective of the whole project, I would say, to find those people and cultivate them and bring them especially into English if they're not already writing in English, because many people are just writing in their local language, which is natural. But as you know, the academic world, the media world is dominated, for better or worse, by the English language. So I wanted to make sure these people who might remain undiscovered were known by people around the world. A third point I would say was to generally, in the process of considering different kinds of conservatism and finding new conservative thinkers, I wanted to kind of bring them together and unite the right, so to speak. I was tired of seeing more than 2 decades of infighting on the right. While looking over across the aisle to the left, what I saw was that they tended to avoid, generally speaking, the infighting that we have so common on the right. And I kept asking myself, why can't we do that? Why can't we use the tactics that the left uses and form a massive bloc, unite all our peoples, all our tribes? Now, I apologize for going on so long, but it's important to make the following point. This is kind of the strategy that William F. Buckley used in the United States, and others like him, not just him, of course, when they united the various rights in America, which included the classical liberal and libertarian right, and then the traditional social conservatives, and then the hardcore anti-communist kind of military hawks. And they united, and they led to eventually, summarizing it dramatically here, to Reagan in the White House. And so I kept thinking, while living and working in Europe, we've got to find a way to work cross borders and unite the right. My fourth and last point would be that the fourth objective of the European Conservative, and I think this is apparent when you look at the print edition in particular, is to remind people of the legacy of the Judeo-Christian West, remind people of the legacy of the West in general, of Western civilization, the artistic and architectural and literary legacy that we have, all our inheritance. It's all ours. It's all, we have inherited this. Many of us do not even realize it. Many of us don't care. And at the same time, we have external threats of people from foreign countries, different cultures, who don't care about that legacy of ours or who want to destroy it. So those are, roughly speaking, 4 key objectives for this whole project.
Thank you. There are so many interesting points to unravel. And let me just first go with one thing that stood out to me. You said you were looking for the new Scruton, for example. And for those who maybe don't know, he's like one of the most famous.
I'll give you a Dutch example. I can give you Andreas Kinniking or Bart Jan Sprout, or even, I mean, there are people on the right who love Thierry Baudet, and I know him well. So whatever form your conservatism comes in, we have to find the next generation.
That's a fair point. Do you think that you have had many of those finds? Have you found many new Andreas Kinnigings of the world? How has it been like to see this process unfold?
It's been terribly exciting and wonderful. And I think one of my big frustrations is not being able to handle or master 6, 7, 8 languages so that I can navigate these different countries and linguistic traditions. In other words, there are people I met in Croatia and in Serbia, really, really talented young intellectuals on the right. And I just wish that we didn't always have to speak either in Italian or Spanish or English. I wish I could speak to them in their own language. The process is ongoing. Some of the people that we have found or met and then promoted are beginning to make it big, let's say, and have developed massive followers on social media or have acquired positions of some prestige in different institutions. So, yes, I think the fruits are beginning to show.
That's great. I think we do indeed need it very much. And one point that you pointed out about uniting the right, I think we talk on a political level. I think, for example, in the Netherlands, where I'm from, you see so many small right-wing parties. Of course, you have now one big one. The major one is of the PVV of Geert Wilders, but you have a few others. There's always this clashing. Why do you think that the right has this tendency to fight, while the left has this tendency to unite?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's always the very obvious philosophical or theoretical reason is that the right is allergic to attempts to form mass movements. You know, the right is really about, in my mind, the locally rooted traditions and local customs. And so that doesn't lend itself to easy amalgamation or aggregation. So there's built into the very DNA of what it means to be on the right, I think, an aversion or resistance to forming large blocks. That said, I think there are ways to put that aside temporarily and focus on the broader, bigger civilizational areas where we're all under threat by the radical left, by the LGBT, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is another challenge, I think, that goes beyond that theoretical or philosophical challenge I just mentioned, which is just the nature of politics, the nature of the backroom dealing and the horse swapping or horse trading that is part and parcel of the whole political realm. And there's no way around that. I think it's going to happen. It will never not be with us. And that's why I am particularly a champion and supporter of any politician or political leader that refuses, as much as possible, to engage in the political in that way and holds on to ideals and principles. And I'm thinking right now of Nigel Farage, or I'm thinking of other people like Orban, who basically put their money where their mouth is. What they say is what they do, and what they do reflects what they have said. And those kinds of political leaders with that moral courage and the clarity that their convictions brings are few and far between. There are a lot of conservative politicians out there, but a lot of them, unfortunately, I have seen too ready and willing to sacrifice some of the core principles in exchange for the achievement of some goal in the European Parliament or with the Commission, or in exchange for some funding. You know, I wonder often how much we could achieve if more leaders across Europe just said, basta, enough, no more, to the powers in Brussels.
That's a very good point, and I think people are getting sick of what's happening, no matter if it's mass migration, if it's the climate thing. There are many issues where people are just sick of it, but still people have the feeling, I feel like, that they have a hard time to actually empower themselves. So what advice would you give to ordinary citizens of, for example, the Netherlands or other European countries? They see their world changing. What can they actually do themselves to, maybe if they have a right-wing approach, to see this in their lives happening?
Well, one of several possible responses or suggestions would be to do precisely what you and I and so many others have been doing, which is to create alternatives. And this can take place, in our case, in the media realm, in the world of news, create new platforms, online or print, provide alternatives to the mainstream legacy media. But it should also and can also take place in other sectors of society, in the educational field, for example. We know that the legacy institutions, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, are completely woke, completely corrupted, completely polluted. Even when there's one solitary individual there who may be conservative, he or she is surrounded by a polluted environment, and he or she must often keep their head down. So in the case of education, we can also and should also create our own institutions. We start small and we start building them up. We create a network of schools, summer academies. There are many possible approaches to that. And then other sectors, book publishing also. The book publishing industry, I have learned the hard way in the last several years, is so sclerotic, so controlled by, first, very large book publishers, which tend to be progressive or liberal, centrist, and kind of resistant to publishing right-wing books or conservative books, but also it's been set up in such a way that it prevents new and unknown scholars from getting published. You either have to have an agent, or you have to submit a complicated proposal, and then it gets reviewed. And then if you get through that gauntlet of requirements, maybe your book will appear a year, 2 years, 3 years later. It's absolutely ridiculous. So that's another sector or industry that is in desperate need of complete disruption and the recreation of things at a small scale and then building up. So media, education, publishing, and you can go on to other sectors. In every field, I think, to answer your question now and to wrap up, I think we should be creating our own alternatives, our own structures, our own institutions. What can we do to empower ourselves? We give ourselves power by creating something and by not relying on the grace or the mercy or the generosity of others.
That's a good point. Only thing that I wonder though, because we get asked this a lot. Let's say that you're in another field. Let's say you are a farmer. Let's say you are not in one of those fields that is directly, let's say, influencing the culture or education. And people will also want to be part of this fight, so to speak, against the left-wing totalitarian way of living that we're seeing more and more. Do you think there's also a role that they can play in all of this?
The small-scale farmers, the workers, the people who are trying to meet the needs of a growing family, if they can participate, sure. Although I'll say to you what I've said in the past to some people who have those livelihoods. They're already doing the work of conservatism by having children and by sacrificing for their children. That itself is a sign of contradiction in our times. That in itself is heroic. But if they want to go even deeper or further with their political engagement, there are ways. There are many ways, and I've seen in different countries how average citizens, stay-at-home moms, retired farmers, retired professors, what have you, even taxi drivers, have joined local associations to either organize protests, to do letter-writing campaigns. I think that's less effective in Europe than it is in the United States, and to do all manner of politicking, of engagement in the political. So there are ways.
That's good. It's good to be hopeful, I guess, in these times where it's kind of demoralized for people. I'm also quite curious because we started talking about, let's say, European Conservative. What's been to you the biggest surprise as the editor-in-chief of the European Conservative?
Well, I mentioned one of them, which was the infighting on the right, because when I moved to Europe 25 years ago, from South America, where I was working, I really thought that it would be much easier to get my Italian right-wing friends to talk to and collaborate with my French right-wing friends. And actually, what I found in those years was a kind of lack of interest in knowing the other. That's completely changed. But that was one of my early surprises. It's changed because of people like Orban and others who have shown that we need all work together. But the other big surprise is just the sheer level of bureaucracy on not just on the right, but in general. But even if we focus on the right, there's a lot of the activities are promoted by different foundations in Europe, and in their effort to ensure a transparency and that everything is above board, they've implemented so many regulations that they've become highly bureaucratic, and it's work with some of these organizations and foundations. And that, for me, is really one of my more recent surprises. And I don't know if there's anything that can be done about it.
All right. So we see now that there's a lot of more popularity when it comes to right-wing parties winning more and more elections across Europe. We see it in Netherlands. We see it in Germany, Austria, Italy, you name it. Has this impacted the European Conservative from your perspective?
Yes, positively, of course. There's a surging interest in not just conservative commentary, but conservative news, conservative reporting that doesn't try to pretend that it's completely objective, which is an impossibility, but which is quite open and honest and transparent about the values from which it is operating. I think that's an important thing to say, and I try to say it a lot because I have an ongoing discussion, argument really, with a couple of people who are themselves conservative but have spent decades in media and journalism, and they insist there's no such thing as conservative journalism. I disagree wholeheartedly with them. I think there is, because there is no such thing as mainstream or objective journalism or media. Everybody's got a bias. Everybody has a lens through which they view the world and political events. And you just have to be upfront about it, or you try to hide it like the mainstream media does. So we try to be upfront with that. And people are flocking to this, meaning I think people have realized and are continually realizing more and more that the legacy media has been lying to them, not reporting to them certain things, particularly surrounding the migration or regarding migration and crime. And I think people are getting fed up with that and are beginning to look for alternative sources of news and information and data. And so in that respect, I think it's a good time for people like you and me and others, because the attention is shifting and people want more of this. So it's a very good impact that we've seen in recent months in particular.
And why do you think that there's such an increase like in the demand for right-wing media and right-wing politics all of a sudden?
Well, the demand for the media, I think, stems from the growing demand for conservative or right-wing politics. And that's stemming from the same kind of realizations I just described regarding the media changes. I think people are beginning to see that there's a disconnect between what their political leaders, the political class, and the media is telling them about the world, and what those recipients of news and information see all around them in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in their towns. They see that there's a problem with drugs, with crime, with immigration. It's so obvious. Ask anyone to walk down the streets of some places in Paris or London, and you cannot deny what your eyes are seeing. It's here, and so I think people have realized that we need a change in politics, that we need a change of direction. We need something new. And I think people have also realized, particularly conservatives, that the old model of conservatism no longer works. That old model of consensus-based approach to problems, working across the aisle with the left, and trying to be gentlemen about it always. That model, as much as I love it, as near and dear as it is to my heart, isn't working, doesn't respond to today's needs and demands. And something more daring, more strident, more aggressive at times is necessary in terms of political messaging, in terms of political rhetoric, and in terms of policies.
I think it's an interesting point you mentioned here. There's a lot of criticism from the left, right, that to the right is becoming more extreme. Of course, you always have these fascist accusations and Nazi accusations, all of those. Do you think that there's, let's say, any merit, playing devil's advocate, to some of this criticism to the right?
Well, I think it's ironic to hear these criticisms from the left and progressives and even some centrists, because they're the ones who have created this situation. You know, they're the ones who initiated the movement toward the extremes, the greater polarization, because as the new left and others, new left forces have grown in influence and in financial power and have gained political seats around the world, they have pushed the whole pendulum into one direction. And those of us who used to be kind of center right are now extreme right, it seems, or according to the left. So I think they have to shoulder the blame for much of this. It's not we who have chosen this fight. This fight has been thrust upon us. It's not we who have chosen to be more and more extreme. We've not changed our principles or our ideas or our values. It's still about family and tradition and church and private property, et cetera, et cetera. It's just that those things are now considered extreme because the whole mainstream has shifted. So they have to shoulder that blame.
Fair point. And a lot of this criticism, of course, not only comes from politicians, but also comes from the media. And I think a lot of people feel kind of let down and dissatisfied by the current affair of like mainstream media. And my question for you is, do you think that this feeling of, like, let's say most people, is this satisfied? Is it justified?
Is it justified that they're feeling criticized or persecuted by the media? Is it?
No. My question is, like, they feel let down by the media. Do you think they feel that the quality of the media has gone down? What's your response to that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we began before the interview formally began today by referring to how the mainstream media in the U.S. was covering the Madison Square Gardens rallies for Trump. I mean, there were stories that basically said something to the effect of, the last time this many people gathered here for a political rally was in the late 1930s for a pro-Hitler rally. I mean, is that serious journalism, really? It's incredible. So, yeah, I think the media has lost credibility. I think the media has no moral high ground to stand on. And it's about time, because it's not just now with Trump that they're doing this. This has been in the works. They've been working or operating in this corrupt, immoral, unjust, unfair, dishonest way for decades. And so the roosters have come home to roost, as we say.
Do you think there's a way we can, in Europe or more generally in the West, that we can restore like the trust that there once was in our media?
It's an interesting question, because I'm not convinced yet, and maybe you'll have to convince me, that we need to do anything about the loss of trust in the mainstream media, in the global media. Maybe the time has come for those things to die off, in the same way that I think the time has come for supranational, multilateral institutions and organizations to be reconsidered. And maybe they should, some of them or all of them, should be shut down. I mean, we're in a time when we have to look back at all the products and fruits of the age of globalization, and all the entities and processes and mechanisms and companies that were multinational and global that were set up in the latter half of the 20th century. And we have to wonder, is that a good way forward for us? Is that a good way to ensure the survival of the values and traditions at the local level that we so love and care about? Now, having said that, it's not like the whole world's going to come to agreement on this. We're still going to have global actors, superpowers like China and Russia and others, North Korea, who are going to play that international game, who are going to play the game of large institutions and large entities doing big things. So we need to think carefully about how we're going to approach that. But coming back to your media question, restoring the trust in the media, like I said, I'm not sure we need to do anything about that global media. If they've lost the trust, they'll lose clients and readers, and then they'll go bankrupt, perhaps. But there's always something new in the works, right, Daniel? There's always creative, inventive people out there creating something new. So I'm not concerned if CNN suddenly shuts its doors. There'll be something new to take its place.
That's a good point. I guess my only concern is not so much with the media companies themselves, with the CNNs of this world or the New York Times. My concern is more that we're moving towards, let's say, lower trust societies, where institutions in themselves, including institutions that we as right-wing or conservative people care about, are being distrusted, some rightfully so, maybe some less. I think in the West, one of the great things that we had, right, was that we have high trust societies because we actually had great functioning institutions. And that's why I'm a little bit less positive about, let's say, the derailment of the media.
Yeah, no, and that's an excellent point. The decline or the loss of high trust societies in the West. Absolutely correct there. And of course, we can look at all the different contributors to this situation, including the importation of mass groups of people who don't share the fundamental values of Europe or of European nations, and how that erodes trust. But I think, and I've heard people argue this way, and I can take issue with it. But you almost have to hit bottom in order to reemerge again. You have to, the loss of a high trust society will lead to perhaps greater social conflict, or the potential or possibility of greater social conflict. And then out of this will emerge perhaps the creation of something new, and we will rebuild the institutions and the entities of society that were there in the first place, and then trust will be regained. Trust is not a static thing, of course, right? It takes preservation and maintenance, like in any good relationship. Both sides have to be willing to maintain, to give and to take a little bit, and to work on it. And once that's lost, it's not permanently lost. It just has to be rebuilt. So one of our tasks as conservatives, as right-wingers, however you want to label ourselves, is to find the ways to rebuild that, rebuild those mechanisms and processes, rebuild the trust, create new societies. But absolutely, I'm absolutely convinced that all that requires, at the very least, a certain degree of shared something, je ne sais quoi, some kind of homogeneity, whether it's of people or a shared language, or ideally those shared cultural reference points and values, because otherwise it's not going to work at all.
That's a good point, but I will say, of course, like, we know that there's like a big attack on, let's say, Western values, on Western culture, and even among conservatives or right-wing people, even if they share these values or way of living, they find it very difficult to explicitly defend it, because it's like so obvious to them that they don't know how to deal when it's attacked. So I'm curious, how would you advise just common people in European nations, how can they defend the way of living and the values that they treasure, but that's being under attack constantly?
Well, there's several ways to address this, and I'll start with the most extreme, I suppose, and it's come to my attention through certain reports that I've read and certain accounts, which is resistance communities or resistance identities, the building of extreme versions of the Rod Dreher-Benedict option, where people are basically creating intentional alternative communities of self-selected members and are preparing with a stockpile of food and supplies, batteries, and firearms. This in particular in the U.S., right? So this is alarming. This is a direct consequence of the loss of a high trust society, and it's also fed by a certain degree of perhaps paranoia. We could admit that, but that is not isolated to the U.S. And without naming the countries where I've encountered this, I have heard in different pockets of Europe of people doing something similar, preparing for something worse to come, retreating into the mountains, finding a cabin, building underground bunkers. It's alarming. I mean, it sounds like I'm reading one of my favorite dystopian novels. So that's on the extreme version. To answer your question of like, how can people defend their values and their traditions in the face of this onslaught? Well, here's one response. I don't necessarily recommend it. I believe we have to engage in our culture, not retreat from it. I think we all have a role to play here, whether it's in the media or in business or in education. And I think we have to fight. So a less extreme response is basically to do, if you're a parent and you have children in the local school and they're feeding them transgender nonsense, then that parent, as a parent, should get involved and go down and express their opinions and go down to the school and say, no, my child will not be imbibing of this rainbow-colored nonsense. Of course, in some countries, then that parent is probably a criminal problem. If I were such a parent in the UK, I would be particularly concerned, because the UK, for me, is in the vanguard of a completely secularized police state. It's terrifying. But in other countries, parents could rebel in this way. the Manif pour tout movement in France a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, was interesting because that was parents and families going out onto the streets to protest gay marriage. Things like that, social pressure, civil disobedience, those are all tools and tactics that could be considered. That's just to begin, that's just, to scratch the surface of all the possible ways we could respond.
It's a good point. I think all those things that you just mentioned, I've seen them also in the Netherlands. I think it's very relatable in a way, sadly, that we are at this point. But it's good to be realistic sometimes.
Yes, well, yes. And realism requires that you be informed of all the possibilities, right? So that then you can take a sober account of things, map out paths, potential paths, and then arrive at a clear-headed conclusion or decision if necessary. Absolutely.
Exactly. I have one final question, and that is, where do you see Europe going? Of course, we have these different paths. We see now things in motion. Of course, you're not fortune tellers, but I'm curious, what do you see as the future of Europe at this point?
I'm not sure you really want me to respond to that, because what you may not know is that some of my friends have started calling me Dr. Doom. And it's because I've been so insistent about the negative or the deleterious situation that Europe finds itself in now. I find it hard, Daniel, to find reasons for great hope right now. Meeting people like you gives me hope. Meeting the other people that I referred to earlier gives me a little hope for the future. For my lifetime, whatever years remain in my life, I don't think I'm going to see the changes or the turnaround of Europe or the West broadly that I would like to see. I think the America of my childhood, the Europe and South America of my childhood, because I share roots in down there as well, is gone. And I don't think I will ever see that America, that South America, that Europe with which I was raised. My hope lies with the younger people like you and others and the future. And I think Europe will come out of this. It may not look the way I remember it to have looked. I think it will come through this period of what I can only call a new dark ages, possibly a new feudal era emerging, a techno-feudal era, and something new will emerge. And hopefully the people driving a new society, a new European civilization, will have the values and principles that reach back across time to the medieval synthesis, to Greece and Rome, to all the things that we all love so much about this thing called Western civilization, this thing called European civilization. In my lifetime, I don't have hope. In the future, 1, 2, 3, 4 generations, I think we'll be fine.
I guess, even though that might be dark, the end is hopeful. So in that sense, maybe you're not missing doom after all. But I really want to thank you for your time and having this interview with us. I also want to thank our listeners and our readers. If people want to follow you, where can they find more from your work or about you?
They can go to europeanconservative.com, and that'll take them to our home site. It's primarily news and analysis with some of the content from the print magazine. If they prefer the print magazine, the print quarterly, which is definitely a slightly different product, they can find at that very site, at the shop, a way to either buy individual copies or subscribe. Like I said, it's a quarterly, and the quarterly is much more focused on philosophy, literature, the arts, beauty, and all the non-political kind of aspects of life.
Thank you so much. And if you want to support or follow us, you can also, of course, go to our website, nieuwrechts.nl, or find us at our social media, and see you in the next time.
Thank you, Daniel.